Okay, it's 2 o'clock. That means it's Sundays at 2. I want to welcome all of you to the 29th season of Sundays at 2, an incredible program that has lasted actually 30 years. We closed one time in 30 years for COVID, that's it. And in that time period, we have featured at least 170 distinct speakers and topics. It's pretty incredible for our backwoods rural area. We've had quite an array of speakers that cover, you name the topic and we've had it. We're all here. This program has always been 6 programs in the January to March timeframe, 6 different speakers covering all kinds of different topics. The Sundays at 2 program was started by a woman named Gloria Wallace. And show of hands of who knows, remembers, okay, Gloria. So Gloria founded the program and was the chairman of it for 25 years. And she remained active the year after she stepped down from being chairman, and then she passed away at the young age of 97. She was vibrant and engaged the entire time. She cracked a whip and we all followed. The committee is an integral part to bringing the program to you, so I would like to introduce the committee to you and those who are essential. So Ernie Monshine was the chairman immediately following Gloria, and now I'm the chairman, trying to fill lots of big shoes. And then we have Sheila Stepko, Sandy Toomey, we have Bud Ward, Alice Cooper, library director and ex officio member. Bud is outside. Pat Toomey is also a member of our committee, but she's not here today. And we couldn't do any of this without Shelley Robertson, who is the technical guru for the library, and we are grateful for her support. All of the committee members are residents of Lancaster County. Let's see. You can see over here the program description of the entire program. Can I see a show of hands of who was here last week for the Beanies? Good, welcome back. We're glad to have you. So after Brad Perry, we have 4 more programs. The last program, however, is now TBD. Unfortunately, our speaker was not able to come. He lives in California and was not going to be able to come. So we are in the process of replacing that last one. So that will be the 23rd of March. For those of you out in Facebook land, welcome. We're glad to have you here with us. And if anybody wants to see the program later, it will be available on the library's YouTube channel, so you can see it again and again and again. I will be showing it to my grandchildren because they're big NASA fans. And I also want to call your attention to the table right outside the door where the library is selling lottery tickets. And I encourage you all to buy lottery tickets so that the library continue to have programs like this. So, and we were joking at lunch that if you buy a lottery ticket, we'll give you tickets to Sundays at 2 for free. How's that? How's that? So, with no further ado, let me turn it over to Ernie Monshine to introduce Brad.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Good group here today. I'm really pleased with that. You're in for a little treat today, or shall I say a big treat, with Brad Perry. And as you can see from our topic today about NASA, this guy that's done all kinds of things we were talking at lunch, and I swear he could do 20 of these presentations, and everyone would be different from the one before. So he's got a lot to cover today. I will ask, by the way, before I introduce Brad, that we hold our questions to the end. We'll leave time at the end for questions and answers and so forth, so that we can keep rolling in that time. And Brad will be here for a bit afterwards, when we're doing cookies and coffee, for conversations, questions, not personal questions, but questions about his presentation about NASA. Darn right. All right, so without further ado, let me quickly introduce Brad so you can get me off here and you can get to the real stuff. So anyway, it's really hard not to feel inadequate introducing today's speaker. Brad's love affair with space began at least as far back as 1972, when he convinced his dad to let him build a replica of the Apollo command module in the basement of his Albemarle, North Carolina home in order to simulate the Apollo 16 mission in real time. After going on to earn a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech and serving as a pilot in the Air Force and Texas Air National Guard, his full-time NASA career began as an astronaut trainer. We'll hear a bit about the impressive range of missions he contributed to over his 32 years at NASA, eventually earning both NASA's Exceptional Service and Outstanding Leadership medals. But if that is not enough, as a side hustle, Brad completed graduate studies in astronomy at the University of Virginia and has published over 20 peer-reviewed papers based on his professional observations of various stars, nova, supernova, and planetary objects. In his spare time, I don't know if he has any spare time, maybe in the middle of the night, he has taught the introductory astronomy course at William & Mary's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for 16 years. He is perhaps best known in the Northern Neck for his work with the church in support of community activities throughout the region. Ordained in 2021, he serves as the associate pastor at historic White Marsh Church in Lancaster. He and his lovely wife Joni, who's over here manning the AV table, write and arrange original Christian music and hymns as the duo Alabaster Grace. This guy does a lot of stuff. They represent music and speak in churches and other venues throughout the Northern Neck and Hampton Roads areas through the nonprofit Alabaster Grace Ministries. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Brad Perry, space fan extraordinaire, and on top of that, really nice guy. Let's hear it for Brad.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me in the back good? Okay. We've got a lot to cover, and I know you're going to have some great questions, and I look forward to those at the end of the presentation. So I did my Apollo simulation of Apollo 16 in 1972, but I want to start 4 years earlier than that, back in 1968, because it was the fall of 1968 when I was just 13 years old. I went to the school library, and there on the cover of National Geographic was Sending Men to the Moon. And I read that article, and I read it again. I think I memorized it. I was mesmerized. Sending Men to the Moon. I was 13. I was old enough to understand the significance of sending men to the moon, because up to that point, we had just had astronauts in Earth orbit, a couple hundred miles at most above the surface of the Earth. The moon, almost 250,000 miles away. Wow. Well, I was ready to go to work for NASA then, but they weren't hiring any 13-year-olds. And so I had to do the next best thing, which was have my own Apollo program. So that's what I did. And I'd like to take 4 minutes or so just to set the stage so that we can all relive or recalibrate to what the conditions were for the Apollo program in our country back in 1968, with the Apollo 8 crew members and others talking.
If you were a scriptwriter for the movies, you couldn't have picked a better scenario than Apollo 8.
We hear from the CIA that the Russians are going to send a spacecraft around the moon with a person in it and upstage us.
If they orbit the moon before we land on the moon, then they've gotten there first.
We changed our plans of Apollo 8. They changed the mission from an Earth orbital type to a flight to the moon. And it was a bold move. It had some risky aspects to it. But it was a time when we made bold moves.
The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Alright, Houston, your trajectory and guidance are go, over. Thank you, Michael. You're looking real good, man.
It wasn't until we rolled over that we actually saw the moon for the first time. We were just 60 miles above the craters, and, you know, we were sort of like three school kids looking in a candy store window. We forgot the flight plan, and here we are, just 60 miles away.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. Wow, is that pretty? You got a color film, Jim? Can't be a roll of color. Oh man, that's color. Where is it? Just grab me a color. A color exterior.
We took photographs as much as we could. And of course, we took the photograph of the famous Earthrise around the moon. And I have to credit Bill Anders for taking the picture. He claims it all the time anyway.
Hey, calm down, Bubba. Well, I got it right. Oh, it's a beautiful shot.
And of course, Christmas Eve, being around the moon on Christmas Eve, we thought this would be a very auspicious time to say something. The three of us selected to read from the Old Testament, and we had it in fireproof paper in the back of our flight manual.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
I thought it was a very nice touch. It fit very nicely into getting away from all this machinery, and let's get down into sort of the fundamentals of what makes all this happen. Why are we here? I liked it.
Big close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
We took photographs.
So, my plan was to build a full-scale interior mock-up of an Apollo command module in the basement. I went down to the basement and I made the measurements, and I thought, well, if we cut about a foot off the tunnel height at the top, it'll fit. So I put my plans together. Remember, I'm 13 now. And I presented my plans to my parents. They said, "You want to do what? Are you crazy? No, we can't do that." But I had great parents, both my mom and my dad. They taught me the lesson of persevering early in life. So I persevered on this one. 5 months later, they said yes, provided I paid for it. And I had a paper out that I could use to pay for it. So it was about $2,500 in early 70s dollars, which was about my total income from the paper route for the 2.5 or 3 years that it took to build the project. So my dad took a week off from work in June 1969, 1 month before the Apollo 11 historic landing. And we were going to knock it out. By the end of the week, we had the floor built. That was it, nothing more than about 6 inches off the floor, literally. And we both realized this was a big undertaking. It was going to take some real doing and some real time. My mom was gracious to let me borrow Dad for a lot of this next 2.5-year period, as it turned out to be. Because although I was by then 14, I still didn't know how to do everything. And it was a great father-son project as we worked on it together. So I'd like to show you how we began. We began with almost nothing knowledge-wise, information-wise on the real Apollo command module spacecraft. I had this Revell 1/48 scale model of the Apollo. And I knew that the diameter of the heat shield on the bottom was 12 feet, 10 inches. So we, in building the interior mock-up, didn't need the heat shield. We needed the interior. And so we scaled up all these components, multiplying by 48 to get the scale of the mock-up. And that's how we did it. Well, along the way, there was a reporter down the street that took interest in this because, you know, sort of unique. Not too many kids doing this sort of thing. Although I think a few others did it here and there across the country. And he came and did a story on what we were doing. It ran the local rap record, which was the Stanley News and Press down there in Albemarle, North Carolina, 40 miles east of Charlotte, where I grew up. And then Dad goes out and gets the Charlotte Observer the next Sunday, and there it is, the story's on the front page of the Charlotte Observer. We never anticipated it would receive that level of attention, but it did. And a byproduct of Fred Morgan, the reporter doing this, was he got me introduced to a NASA engineer, Bob Ernle, who had married a local Albemarle girl. And so my source of information on the Apollo command module and the Apollo missions began to exponentially increase in fidelity and detail. And I had the flight plan starting with Apollo 12 onward for each of the Apollo missions, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Also, it got TV attention with the local CBS affiliate, WBTV in Charlotte, coming to visit. They had a human interest segment called Carolina Camera, and they were going to come film it in half a day. And they came and stayed 3 days. And this was another surprise to us. It ran on the local station, but we got a call about 50 minutes before it was going to run on Walter Cronkite, CBS Evening News. And it ran on the CBS Evening News the Friday before the Apollo 15 flight launched in July 1971. We had just completed the project, and I was ready to do my simulation because the whole goal was to build this thing so I could go through all the motions that the real astronauts do. We worked 31 hours without rest to finish it, and we were done. I was pretty much done, but I did a partial simulation of Apollo 15, and I used the 9 months between Apollo 15 in July 71 and Apollo 16 in April 1972 to train as completely and as realistically as I could for the Apollo 16 mission. And I did go in the command module, and I stayed in the command module for the full duration of the Apollo 16 mission. So you're wondering, how long was that? Well, it was 11 days, 1 hour, and about 50 minutes, plus or minus a bit there. So it was a long time to be locked up in this thing in the basement. But it all worked. In the process of getting ready for Apollo 16, I had a chance to go train in astronomy at the Moorhead Planetarium because the Apollo astronauts had to do sextant star shots to navigate to the moon and back. And this is one of the star charts that they used, and I had a copy of this. They had 40 stars that they used to navigate with, and of course they had the trained capability to recognize the proper constellations and so forth. I also went to Houston, and I trained with the flight controllers and a little bit with the real astronauts. I want to tell you a little aside here. So I'm on the floor where they have the simulators for both the command module and the lunar module, and somebody taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Jim Irwin, who had just flown to the moon with Dave Scott landing on Apollo 15. And he said, Brad, I know you're here to study all this command module stuff. The command module just orbited the moon. He said, but let's go land on the moon. So we went up the stairs to the lunar module simulator. And I stood over there because it had the couches. The limb you had to stand up in. They made every effort to make that as light as possible so that it would fit and the mission could work. So I'm over there standing where he stood, and he's standing where Dave Scott stood on the left-hand side, and I'm watching Jim Irwin land this simulator on the moon. I'm almost 17 years old, and I'm pinching myself. I'm watching one of the men that just landed on the moon do it for real here in the simulator, and I was just taken by that. And that was a very special time. So we went to Houston with suitcases packed with clothes, but we came home with suitcases packed with Apollo checklist and flight plans. And I have a lot of artifacts up here that I'd like for you to see up close after the presentation's over. Lunar maps for navigating and recognizing where you are in lunar orbit. And of course the flight plan, which had basically about a page for each hour of the mission showing what the astronauts were scheduled to do. So the flight plan had the overall purview and outline of the mission, but it took a lot of checklists to make it work. Here's the Command Service Module guidance and control checklist. And of course, not everything always goes really smooth. So you have to have a contingency checklist for when things go wrong. And I had all the system diagrams as well so I could troubleshoot problems as they came up. After the simulation was over, I even wrote a little report about it. So it was quite an endeavor. Along the way, the people that provided the real Apollo food came and asked if they could give me some of the food that they were preparing for the actual astronauts. So I have some of that in these containers. This one is butterscotch pudding. I think it's probably exceeded its shelf life right now. But in any event, I had the complete menu that the astronauts had, and my mom prepared most of the food that I consumed. And of course, if you look at the flight plan, they got on an inverted schedule pretty early in the mission. So I was eating in the middle of the night. My mom was preparing this food. We did not have a way to freeze dry it, so she would put it in a closeout compartment so it was always where it's supposed to be, and I could pull it in and eat it. I never saw anyone, no one ever saw me. Also, I dispensed with the pressure suit, but I had the in-flight coveralls like they wore, like you saw the Apollo 8 astronauts floating about inside the Apollo 8 command module on the way to the moon. In conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Apollo, I found this book, which I recommend. It's a very accurate detail of the Apollo 8 mission. And of course, the 50th anniversary of Apollo ran from Apollo 7-8 flying in 1968. So the 50th anniversary started in 2018, ran through 2022, when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the last lunar landing mission, Apollo 17, that flew and landed on the moon in December 72. So anyway, that's a little bit about Apollo, and we'll talk more about other things on the table here in a minute. So for the mission, I simulated a little bit of what all three astronauts were doing when they were in the command module, when the commander and the lunar module pilot went into the lunar module to undock and go down to the surface of the moon. I was just following one-on-one the actions of Ken Mattingly, TK Mattingly as they called him. He was the command module pilot on Apollo 16. So I have a video here I'd like to show you. This is some scenes of this. This is a young Brad back in 1972. Well, after Apollo 16, it was time to make decisions on going to college and how to get to NASA as quick as I could. Remember, they wouldn't hire me as a 13-year-old, but I made some positive impressions when I went down there, almost 17, to train for the Apollo 16 mission. I turned 17 right after that mission flew. And so I went to Georgia Tech. They had a co-op program, and I was accepted in that, and they sent me directly to NASA to Houston. I actually went down there on a self-funded interview, and of course they knew me from before, and I was hired very quickly. So I started after one semester, actually one quarter, it was the quarter system back then, at Georgia Tech. And I joined NASA in January '74. The last Skylab mission was flying at that time, and they didn't know what to do with the green youngster who just reported was not even a high school graduate a year ago. So they gave me a green badge, and I got to sit in mission control and watch everything for the remainder of that Skylab 4 mission, the last of the 3 manned missions to Skylab. I was right there in the MOPR, as they call it, the Mission Operation Control Room, when they brought the astronauts home entry. And this is the same room that I'd been watching on TV as a slightly younger boy growing up. It was Mission Control also for Apollo. So I had my first assignment in July of 1975, about a year and a half later, when I was actually a flight controller for the next mission, which was the Apollo-Soyuz test project flight. The command module had 3 entry batteries, which were used to supplement power during surge periods of the mission. And my job was to make sure these 3 entry batteries were fully charged for entry, because that was the sole source of power for the command module once it separated from the service module and was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. So I had a lot of supervised help on that. I'll be sure to tell you to convey that. It was a big Hewlett-Packard desktop calculator about like this that does what you can do with your smartphone. And we were integrating the amp hours out so we could put the same number of amp hours back in to the batteries and not overcharge them. So from that, I joined NASA after I graduated from Georgia Tech and worked there until my slot came up to go into the Air Force. And I went through commissioning and pilot training and flew as an Air Force pilot for about 6.5 years, and then rejoined NASA at the end of that service commitment, and also affiliated with the Texas Air National Guard. And I've flown KC-135 and T-38 aircraft while on active duty. And when I got back to NASA, they said, well, you don't have any fighter experience, and we're a fighter unit here at Ellington Field, right by NASA Johnson Space Center. But I talked them in, I persevered. I talked them into letting me be a target pilot. So I flew one of the original jets, the T-33, and they later let me go to training to be an F-4 pilot. So I got to be a fighter pilot as well, and that worked out well. So I served as an instructor for the space shuttle, and my area of expertise was the on-orbit portion of the mission, where we were formation flying close with satellites, which we had either just deployed from the payload bay or were getting ready to retrieve and put back into the payload bay. So it's sort of like fingertip formation flying with fighters, but in orbit. And I also did the RMS, that's the remote manipulator system, the fancy title for the robot arm on board the shuttle. It had 6 joints and operated much like an arm and a hand would in a human sense. And that's what was used to grapple and control and to berth or park the payloads in the bay, also to pick those payloads up we were deploying and to release them. And this required a lot of close coordination between the pilot and commander flying the shuttle and the arm operator. And I worked with those 3 crew members quite a bit. And Later on, I became a sim lead, so I was overall responsible for the entire team training the astronauts, and we would have integrated simulations where we would hook up the shuttle mission simulator to mission control, and we would induce problems and off-nominal challenges for the crew and the ground control to work through together. And that was an interesting area to work in the whole realm of the shuttle mission, from ascent to launch to entry, and training astronauts how to fly entry with degraded capability display-wise, more manual control required, that kind of thing. Have a short video to show you here. This is produced by ESA, the European space folks, but it was done to show the RMS and the proxops for the releasing of the Hubble Space Telescope. And I worked with the crew that trained and deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. Of course, it had the aberration in its eyesight. Remember, everything was out of focus, and it took a follow-on mission to put everything into focus. But what a wonderful 30 years plus of astronomical discovery that telescope has provided. There you see the RMS releasing the Hubble Space Telescope, and you see the reaction control engines firing on the shuttle to maneuver away safely from it. The Hubble Space Telescope was designed to be the maximum size possible for the shuttle payload bay. So this presented a challenge getting it in and out, especially if not all the joints were working on the arm, and we had to train the astronauts how to do it on a single joint basis, which was much more challenging. So additionally, I was in on one of the many redesigns for what became the International Space Station. You might recall back in his State of the Union address in 1984, President Reagan announced that we would be building a space station, and it was known as Space Station Freedom before being known as the International Space Station. And that initial design was very grand, very costly, and it was never affordable. It was never doable. And so NASA kept going through redesigns to downsize it a little bit, make it a little bit more affordable. And this was seemingly like the umpteenth redesign effort that I was involved with, but it's actually the one that resulted in the station as built. We had 3 designs that we worked on, and we presented those to senior management, and they said, well, it's going to be a combination of some of these, but it's actually going to be working with the Russians. And that's when they opened the door, and the Russians that they had been talking to came into the room, and that was the beginning of us working with the Russians on the International Space Station. Also did, along the way, some aeronautics research, and we can talk about that offline if you're interested. But I did professional astronomy. I'd always been interested in astronomy, but of course my degree training was in engineering. But I got into professional astronomy through instrumentation, because astronomy depends upon updated instrumentation that is largely engineering. So I got into the engineering aspects of instruments that are used on large professional telescopes, and that led to the opportunity to do some science and to start publishing science papers. And I did graduate studies in astronomy as my workload would permit over at UVA. Also, I did concept evaluations for new robotic missions. Now, back when Apollo flew, nobody could anticipate back then the capability that would come forth through computer advancement and micro-miniaturization of electronic components, so that we could fly robotic spacecraft and do really smart things, and do it for pennies on the dollar for what it costs to do it with humans. And so I got very involved with the NASA Space Science planetary missions, and also the observatories that were planned for flight in space to observe at wavelengths that you can't observe at on the Earth's surface. And here's a scene of, this is Lick Observatory near San Jose, California. That's through the slit there on the left side is the Shane 3-meter telescope, 120-inch telescope that we use for doing optical and near-infrared spectroscopy of a number of objects. And I thought you might like to see what it looked like. It's not that impressive when you're guiding, but this is guiding the slit as it goes across the face of Jupiter, and this is making sure our measurements are being made correctly. Also observed at the NASA Infrared Telescope Facility in Hawaii. It's on Mauna Kea, the summit of some of the world's largest telescopes there on the Big Island. And there we could do longer wavelength studies than we could do at Lick because we were above 90% of the Earth's moisture in the atmosphere, which makes a lot of the infrared wavelengths opaque. They don't reach the ground. So there's an image where you can see the mirror of the telescope and what the outside of the observatory looks like. Also did some modeling, taking images from Hubble Space Telescope to do relative albedo region comparisons where some areas of Pluto were seen to be brighter than other areas. That's on the left. And of course, all that got completely blown away when we could fly the Pluto New Horizons spacecraft mission by Pluto. This is a scene from LORRI, the 8-inch telescope on board New Horizons 2 days before the point of closest approach. So, a little bit about Pluto, because I worked quite a bit on that. NASA had a mission known as Pluto Kuiper Express, PKE. It was a Jet Propulsion Laboratory provided spacecraft for which they were soliciting people to propose instruments to fly on board. And the spacecraft kept going over costs, and NASA canceled the mission. But there was a young high school student doing an HTML programming course, and he put his page on the internet, saved the Pluto mission, and NASA got about 10,000 letters as a result of that, and reconsidered the Pluto mission, now competing the whole mission, not just instruments for a NASA-provided spacecraft. And I got involved in that because there was an urgency to do it as quick as possible because the science community was concerned that the atmosphere on Pluto, around Pluto, would collapse to the ground as it moved further out in its elliptical 248-year orbit around the sun. And so we had to maneuver and move fast. And we did just that. We did the development of the announcement of opportunity, the solicitation, the phase 1 proposal review, and also the phase A study of the winners out of phase 1 and the phase 2 downslick. We did that whole process in under a year. It normally would take about 2 years to do that. And interestingly enough, 5 years to the day that the announcement of opportunity came out announcing this mission for competition was the day that New Horizons launched, January 19, 2006, to fly by Pluto. A lot of people have asked me, all that effort to get to Pluto, why didn't you go in orbit when you got there? Well, to get there within a decade, we had to launch on a big rocket, have a small spacecraft so it could go real fast, and we had to go by Jupiter 13 months after launch to get a gravitational assist, cut 2.5 years off the flight time to Pluto, making it now 9 years and about 6 months. And of course, that's fast. That's a fast-moving spacecraft. To go in orbit around a small body like Pluto, you have to slow down to almost nothing. So that translates into a huge propulsion system, which would have more than doubled the cost of the mission. So it was from the ground up intended to be a flyby type operation and very successful. En route to Pluto, after the mission launched in January 2006, other satellites, in addition to sharing the large first satellite of Pluto, several other satellites were discovered, and the team had to replan the flyby sequence to have reconnaissance of all the members of the Pluto system, and they did that marvelously. And all this had to be uploaded to the spacecraft to auto-do, because the radio link time from Earth to Pluto at flyby was on the order of 4.5 hours. So if it's not doing what you want it to do, by the time you see that, it's already 4.5 hours past that point. And if you could change it instantaneously, it's another 4.5 hours getting the right sequence up to the spacecraft. Well, the flyby occurred with it going about 11, 12 kilometers per second by Pluto. And so 9 hours would have completely decommissioned the whole close encounter scenario. So it all worked very well. And here's an image of me on the left with the actual spacecraft in the clean room at Goddard Space Flight Center. And I was able to go see it in person right before they packaged it up to ship it down to Kennedy Space Center for the launch later, a few months down the road. And of course, the launch itself on January 19, 2006, it was on an Atlas V 551, because it was an Atlas V with also 5 solid rocket motors on the first stage to give it more thrust. And it went directly from Earth on its trajectory to Pluto without going into Earth orbit. Had 2 stages of the Atlas V, and then had a 3rd stage solid kick motor that put it on a trajectory leaving Earth just a few minutes after launch at 36,000 miles an hour. It's the fastest thing NASA had ever launched. And yet, 13 months to get to Jupiter and 9.5 years to get to Pluto with the speed up at Jupiter. A short video about the New Horizons mission.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have a mission and liftoff of NASA's New Horizons spacecraft on a decade-long voyage to Pluto and then beyond.
And the actual surface of Pluto as rendered by the spacecraft as it flew by. Much, much more detail than what we could tell and discern with remote telescopes. The difference of actually being there. So, some of you may be wondering, how did Pluto get demoted? And when did that occur? Well, it occurred about half a year after the mission launched. So it was on its way. And you would not believe how many people asked me, well, now that Pluto is demoted, what's this New Horizons mission going to see when it gets there? Of course, the answer is what it was going to see anyway. It doesn't matter what you call it. Pluto is Pluto. And so how did all this happen? And just in a short summary fashion, let me say, we had achieved observations from Earth-based large telescopes of objects further out in the Kuiper belt, this outer asteroid belt of the solar system outside of Neptune's orbit, where we could make measurements on these objects, and we knew that they were bigger than Pluto. So we were going to have a bunch more planets, or maybe one less. And the decision was to have one less. And the IAU, International Astronomical Union, came up with 3 criteria for whether a body is a planet. Well, it has to be large enough to accrete into a spherical shape. Pluto did that. It has to orbit the sun and not another body, because that would make it a moon. Pluto met that requirement. But it also had to be large enough to clear out its orbital path, and that's where Pluto failed. And so got demoted, and the term Plutoid came out, or dwarf planet, minor planet. But in any event, Pluto will always be Pluto. Pluto, by the way, was discovered by Clyde Tombaugh at Lowell Observatory back in 1930. And just a bit of trivia, that's the same year that Pluto, the cartoon character, appeared on the scene with Disney. Okay. So a lot of science results from the New Horizons mission, as you can imagine, and I'll let you just scan that briefly. Following the flyby of Pluto in July 2015, the New Horizons spacecraft flew by Arrokoth, which is a contact binary KBO, Kuiper Belt object, further out in the Kuiper Belt. So we've already had a second KBO reconnaissance with this mission. When they launched the mission, it had a total delta V capability of about 150 meters per second, and they used that to steer it to Pluto over its course of the 9.5-year trajectory. And they made a few adjustments to get by Arrokoth. And there's still fuel to do a little bit of that, but it's a fast-moving spacecraft, and you can't steer it too much. So it's still unknown, I believe, today whether they'll have a third encounter. When it flew by Pluto, it was about 31, 32 AU. That's astronomical units. That's the Earth-Sun distance of approximately 93 million miles. So Pluto was about 31, 32 times that, and it's now at over 60 AU and moving outward in the solar system, and will exit the solar system. Still giving us good data. It uses power through a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, RTG, which decays over time, but is still given enough wattage to make a lot of measurements on solar winds and other characteristics of the outer solar system. So why study all these KBO objects in the first place? And the answer is because they're out there far enough in the outer region of the solar system that it's real cold, and they are preserved in their primordial original condition as they formed some 4.5 billion years ago. So it's a look and a peek back at what our solar system looked like in its early epoch or early stages. So I also worked in a similar fashion on the Juno mission that's currently orbiting Jupiter and providing a lot of interesting and updated data to supplement further our understanding from what we learned from Galileo, which first orbited Jupiter in the 1990s. Juno was launched in 2011, took 5 years to get to Jupiter because it went a little bit slower than Pluto mission, New Horizons. But we're learning quite a bit, and the notable thing about Juno that I was very much concerned with in my team, I had for each of these teams, when we looked at the proposals, I led a team of some 50, 60 experts that looked at all aspects of the spacecraft system, the trajectory, the mission design, the management, and the cost, and the phasing for all of that to see if it was doable or obtainium versus unattainium, as my big boss at NASA headquarters would refer to. But Juno was the first mission to use solar panels, new high efficiency solar panels that far away from the sun, because Jupiter is at 5 AU. Remember I said Pluto's more than 30. Jupiter's at 5 AU, and at 5 AU you only have 1/25th of the solar radiance that you have here at Earth. So you have to have big solar panels that are very efficient to make it work. But that's what they went with, and that's how they avoided having to have a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, RTG, like the Pluto mission. And some interesting results from Juno as well. I'll let you just scan those, not only Jupiter, but some of its moons. And it continues to provide great data. It's in its extended mission phase now, and it's funded through September of September of this year. It's going to be September 2025. Also, I worked on the definition, design, and selection process for the near-infrared camera, which is one of the instruments on board the James Webb Space Telescope. And this started in 2001, 2002. We were looking at designs, and we recommended the University of Arizona, and I had to stand up in front of NASA senior management to defend that, just like I had the Juno mission, just like I had the New Horizons mission to Pluto. And the University of Arizona team was selected, and I'm happy to say NearCam is providing awesome results. JWST orbits the sun at the second Lagrange point from Earth. It's a very stable point. It's about 1 million miles from Earth, and it's very cold. This is a lot of people call it the Hubble successor. It is the Hubble successor in timeline, but it's a different telescope. Hubble was largely a visual telescope, and this is an infrared telescope. So it's very important to keep it isothermal, as cold as possible. So that works well at L2. And just to show you how big this telescope is, it's with this thermal shield, it's about the size of a tennis court. You can see people standing underneath this full-scale mock-up. The mirror is an 18-segmented mirror that is articulated, had to be moved into place after the mission was well underway, going to its L2 orbit point. And it took 6 months approximately to get this spacecraft into final configuration, to get it fully deployed and checked out. It was launched on Christmas Day 2021 and began science operations the following summer. And that's just a quick picture with me and John Mather, who is the senior project scientist for JWST. And I had not been talking with him for several years and saw him at a church retreat just this past fall. We got updated with each other, so that was wonderful. It's enabling spectacular discoveries that will continue on for a number of years to come. And because it's an infrared telescope, it can see through dust, and it can see further distance ranges, which means it can see further back in time as we probe what the early universe looked like and learn more about how things evolved just in the first few 100 million years after the Big Bang. A few images real quick from JWST. This is the popular object, it's M57, the Ring Nebula, in both near infrared with the NIRCam that I worked on the left, and then a longer infrared device looking at it, the mid-infrared imager on the right. And as you look at the same object in different wavelength regions, you see different details. Now these are both infrared images, so infrared energy is heat energy. So how do we see that? Well, it's color-coded so that it can be depicted in colors that we can appreciate with our human eyes. But as you study these objects in different portions of the infrared spectrum, you see different characteristics. And a composite of the so-called pillars of creation, a very popular object. This is a combination of both the NIRCam and MIRI images from Webb. Webb is enabling us to study, as I said, galaxies very far away, and similar to what we saw with Hubble, but even more significantly, we see gravitational lensing, where the light from a very distant galaxy passes by close to a star that's closer, and the light is actually bent in accordance to Einstein's work in developing relativity, the time-space warping. And a couple of real quick things to share with you. Very excited about this. The resolution of Webb in the aperture, the total capability of this telescope is enabling us to actually image some planets around nearby stars. These are exoplanets because they're other solar systems around other star systems. And to be able to image that, and this is a sequence of 4 images on the left-hand bottom there in different wavelengths, is phenomenal. And as if that's not amazing enough, we're even able to measure some of the atmospheric constituents of these exoplanets with Webb. So in addition to helping us study the early universe, very far away galaxies, we're using it to study planets orbiting nearby stars in our region of the Milky Way galaxy to learn more about exoplanets, and obviously the big interest there is whether there are planets in the so-called habitable zone that would support life like we know it here on Earth. So, back to Apollo to wrap this up. That's where we started, and that's where I'd like to finish. What happened to it? Well, we built it in the basement, and when we built it in the basement, we never anticipated what would happen to it afterwards. But the Children's Museum in Indianapolis, it's the largest children's museum in the world, developed an interest in it that was facilitated by the Smithsonian. And so they asked to put it on display there. And over my Christmas break from Georgia Tech in 1976, my dad and I disassembled the command module mock-up in the basement and moved it to Indianapolis and reassembled it there. And it was neat being in the museum after hours, you know, because we had a key to get in and we would work the hours that we saw we needed to. Well, 3 months later, in March of 1977, they opened the exhibit at their annual meeting, and NASA flew up Ken Mattingly, who was my counterpart, you'll recall, on the Apollo 16 mission. And he opened the exhibit with me. And it remained on exhibit there until 1985, when the focus was more towards space shuttle type exhibits, and then put in storage. And during that period of time, from 77 to 85, it was viewed by upwards of about 1 million visitors per year. So it had a lot of visibility. And then I retired from NASA in 2013, but after moving to the Northern Neck in 2017, my hometown of Albemarle showed an interest in wanting to put it on display there. So we moved it out of storage in Indianapolis. And again, this was another disassembly and reassembly. And it went on display in my hometown. And I thought you'd like to see what it takes to put one of these things together. This is a 2.5-day time-lapse scenario where when it gets dark, that's the end of each of the days. But here we go. Oops. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Webb. That was terrific.
Just another real quick scene. I want to show you some different views of the exhibit down there in the History Center at Albemarle. And notably, over here on the right, NASA loaned us a lunar rock to be on exhibit with this command module mock-up for a portion of the year that it was on exhibit there. The rock that we got was from Apollo 14, Far Mara Highlands landing area of the moon where that mission operated. That was Alan Shepard and Ed Mitchell's flight on the surface of the moon. And so it was neat to have it there. And I was privileged to have Gene Kranz as my first division chief. And of course, maybe many of you have read his book, Failure is Not an Option. He was the flight director on Apollo 11 when it landed, but he was also the lead flight director on Apollo 13. And when Apollo 13 had that explosion in space, they had not trained for that because that was not deemed survivable. But of course, they had to work through that, and they got those 3 astronauts home very safely. Also, friends in the room here, Dale and Lisa, thank you. They also work for NASA. And this is a shuttle tile that they've given us to look at. And I believe that covers just about everything. And I want to thank you again for the opportunity to talk with you today. And I'll take questions. Thank you.
can take some questions now. Anybody interested? Let's start with him.
How did they come up with budgets? How did they even fathom what was an appropriate budget for some of the things that they worked on?
Well, you do the best costing that you can, and then that's a very good question because you're building things and doing things that have never been done before. So at lunch, several of us were talking about this. Back in the early days of the space program, not long after President Kennedy's challenge to go to the moon and return astronauts safely by the end of the 60s decade, NASA was trying to get their arms around how much is it going to cost to go to the moon? And the administrator at the time was Webb, James Webb, for whom James Webb Space Telescope is named. And he was not an engineer, but an administrator. And he kept probing the engineering teams. Well, have you thought of this? No. Well, go back and put that in your design. How much is that going to cost? And this and that. And so the cost kept going up because it's hard to cost estimate something you've never done before, like going to the moon. And so it resulted in a final figure, but just on his own intuition, he doubled that number on the ride over to the White House to meet with the president. And that turned out to be remarkably close to what the actual cost of going to the moon was in then year dollars, which was about $20 billion. And so I worked for a big boss at NASA headquarters who said, you know, even multiplying by 2 is not sufficient. I say 2.5, he said, no, pi. 3.14. Anything less than pi, you don't have enough cushion room. Yes?
Speaking of sending men to the moon and budgets, what are your thoughts on the upcoming Artemis program and the space launch system, Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Aerojet and Launch Alliance, and they're way over budgeted rocket system versus SpaceX and what's it, Starliner? What's the name of it? SpaceX rocket, but
yes, Blue Origin. I think we're standing at a very interesting point in the evolution of all this. NASA has been encouraging the commercialization of space for a number of years because NASA cannot pay for all of it, and we've seen awesome successes out of SpaceX, but just this past week, SpaceX had a launch failure, and Blue Origin had an initial launch success. Space is a risky business, and it's very expensive. Regarding Artemis, I think the incoming administration is already looking at that and the SLS, the Space Launch System, to see where the most cost-effective decisions can be made. But NASA is embracing the commercialization of space. They talked about this for many years, but who could afford to do it until some billionaires stepped forward to take the first steps in doing that. NASA's role is in doing things for the first time, moving outbound, further exploration, and I'm just as excited as I'm sure you are at the thought of returning to the moon, going on to Mars, maybe more excited than some. Anyway, but the big difference now versus Apollo, which you captured in that initial video, is Apollo was during the Cold War era, and it was part of our strategy to beat the Soviet Union. And Artemis, from the word go, has been a pay-as-you-go system. So we didn't pay a lot, we didn't go a lot. And that's been sort of how we've suffered on that. I think the current schedule they've announced for going back to orbit the moon and then subsequently land on the moon is probably very ambitious still with everything that has to be done. But I'd like to be proven wrong. I'd like to see us go back and do great things. By the way, one more aside, Elon Musk came and talked to my big boss at NASA headquarters one day, and in the meeting that morning beforehand, the boss said, "What do you talk to a billionaire about?" And of course, the answer was anything he wants. And at the time, this was the early 2000s, and at the time, Elon was proposing to fly NASA science payloads on the Falcon 9 rockets he was building. But they had, at that point, a great history in blowing up and not too much of a performance successful history. But all that changed, and today, his Falcon rockets are launching everything, not only NASA science payloads and astronauts to the space station and resupply missions to the space stations, but a lot of other classified and other agency missions as well. So we're thankful that we have the Dragon X to get up to the space station so that we don't have to depend upon the Russians for the ride up and down, which was the case for a number of years after the shuttle was retired in 2011. Yes?
This is more a statement than a question. You use the word amazing a lot, but personally, for listening to this, I think your presentation was amazing. And don't know how anybody remembers all those acronyms and everything. And there will be a test after this, if that's correct. But on the other part, with how much of this was protected until a certain point after you worked? In other words, was it secret?
That's a very good question. The answer is the Apollo program was open domain. The details of the Apollo command module as it was being designed, non-classified. And so it was on a need-to-know basis still and not very publicly available. I didn't have very much information to go on, as I mentioned, until I got plumbed into NASA sources and could start talking with people there, but it was a non-classified program.
Okay, one more question.
What is the material that is used on the James Webb telescope? And it was also looked like the same type of gold-like material on the New Horizon. And what is the function of that gold kind of material?
It's a mylar film that is for thermal protection. It provides thermal protection. Any last question? I'll take one more if someone
Okay,
has
one more.
one. Yeah.
We have
Having had the opportunity to spend time with some of the early astronauts in their labs, I was impressed by their comments about God's creation when, especially the men coming back from outer space. And I wondered if your interest in all of this had any impact on your decision to become a minister.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking.
First, also, aren't you really special to have had parents that encouraged you and helped
Absolutely,
you?
absolutely. I had an awesome mom and dad that sponsored this. Remember, it took me 5 months to talk them into it, but you know, my mom gave up a lot of time with my dad, and she in turn did my food for me when I was in my simulation. But I had the total support of my parents all along, and that made a crucial difference in the success of the Apollo project as well as my career path after that. You know, would I have ever gotten to Georgia Tech without my Apollo project? It's a good question. Maybe not. But I grew up as a believer, and it was very special to see the Apollo 8 astronauts read from the Bible. A little bit of background on that. They were told, let me even back up, just I'll keep this to 2 minutes or less. This is, I think, very significant. The Apollo 8 mission was originally going to be an Earth orbit mission where they checked out the combined capability of the command service module and the lunar module, but the lunar module was not ready, as you heard Jim Lovell say. And so it was August of '68 that George Lowe, Apollo program manager, suggested, well, let's just send Apollo 8 to the moon. And everyone's jaw dropped, because they were nowhere near ready to do that. They didn't even know how to navigate to the moon and back with the spacecraft. But in 4 months, they learned how to do that, and they trained. And along the way, they said, hey guys, you're going to have the opportunity to have the world's largest TV audience. What do you want to read or tell them about? And that's how reading the first 10 verses of Genesis came about. And I'll never forget, as they read those first 10 verses of Genesis from lunar orbit, how compelling that was. And I think of my astronomy interest and my faith. We see the beauty of God's creation when we look up in the night sky. We're blessed to have a dark sky here in the northern neck, and we need to work hard to keep it that way by having lights that shine down and not up into the night sky, causing pollution, light pollution. One of the original reasons Joni and I were attracted to moving here when we had the opportunity to pick where we wanted to live was we have dark skies here. But dark skies enable us to appreciate the beauty of God's creation, like Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the beauty of God, and indeed they do. And so as we work scientifically, we see in many cases scientific verification of what we read about in the Bible. So for me, it's been a very holistic journey, and I'm very happy to talk about this more with you one-on-one, the interrelationship between faith and science. Science tells us how things work. Our faith tells us why things work. And it's all part of God's design. Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad you stay around for individual questions for a short time. We also have cookies, coffee, tea outside in the lobby. I want to thank you all for being here. Our next session is going for Sundays to 2. Will be on February 3rd. Excuse me. I think that's February 2nd. And I hope you can make it. Why America is Losing the War on Drugs with Terry Burke. So please join us for that. And then there's 3 more after that. So with that, how about a round of applause for Burke?